So I'm here to talk about getting started with AWS WAF. My name's Andrew May. I'm the cloud lead at Leading Edge. I've been doing stuff in AWS for about 7 years, and come to us at the Leading Edge booth if you're interested, and I'll also be hanging around at the happy hour at the end. So what is WAF? WAF is Web Application Firewall, and they've changed this so I can't see my own slides. Just a bit more readable. So this is, if you're familiar with traditional firewalls, that's very much IP addresses, protocols, port numbers, that kind of level. This is at a higher level. This is the so-called layer 7 application layer of the OSI model. So this is filtering your HTTP and HTTPS traffic. It's not dealing with sort of random TCP traffic. So it's got access to things like your request headers, your request body, and your parameters. And this, because it's got access to those, you can do more complicated logic about how you filter these requests. So you can protect against certain types of attacks, but that more traditional firewall can't. So that's things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting. Now, WAF is a sort of general industry term. Okay, that's interesting. There we go. What happened there? So WAF's it's a standard term, but AWS has their AWS WAF service. And this is really composed of what they call a web ACL or ACL access control list, plus a bunch of targets you've associated it, and that creates kind of an instance of the web application firewall. And they support a number of different services. So this is tightly integrated with application load balancers, CloudFront distributions, API gateways, and AWS AppSync. You've got 3 real techniques for configuring this. So you're trying to build one of these access control lists, these web ACLs, and you can write your own rules. This can be really powerful because you can do things very custom to your needs. Perhaps you have a requirement that no one else does, so you're going to be writing your own rule for that. You can implement IP address block lists and allow lists, or you can rate limit requests. It's pretty basic, the rate limiting, but it does work. What you're not going to be doing is creating your own rules to cover every possible risk scenario that exists. Now, while they can help you with things like SQL injection detection, writing all of this yourself is both tedious and really unmaintainable. There are always new threats coming out, and you can't possibly expect to be maintaining those all yourself. So that's where these other 2 options of managed rule sets come in. Now, AWS in the last few years started offering their own rule sets, and these are just groups of rules in particular areas, and you get to pick and choose which ones you want to use. You can't select all of them for reasons I'll explain in a minute, but you can target things like the core rule set that covers the OWASP top 10 and other common vulnerabilities, or there's one for databases that protects against SQL injection, some platform-specific ones like Linux and Windows, or I'm running a WordPress site, in which case all bets are off. But on the flip side, you can go with these partner rule sets that you buy from the marketplace. These have been around for longer. They're kind of more of a black box. So whereas AWS will tell you pretty much what's in these different rules and the types of things they detect, and then you can see in your logs, oh, it matched this particular rule ID. With these other marketplace ones, they're a bit of a black box, but they are from companies who specialize. So we've got a couple of the examples here of FortiWeb and F5. These companies do this for a living. They also sell their own WAF products that you can use outside of AWS, but using their managed rule sets inside AWS WAF is probably an easier way to get started. They may not have quite the same level of sophistication of their separate products, but they can continually maintain and adjust these rule sets to meet new threats. AWS does some of that as well, but I would suspect that the people who specialize in this perhaps may have a better response time. When you've picked these, some things you have to consider are priority and capacity. So these rules in the ACL are evaluated in a priority order. So if a particular rule says block, it's not going to go any further in the evaluation. Same thing as if it says allow, it's going to immediately shortcut and continue. So you've got to think about the order you arrange these based upon what you're trying to do. Additionally, there's this concept of capacity. You have a maximum of 1,500 web capacity units, I think, WCUs, that you can allocate to your rules. If you build up your custom rules, it's kind of hard to see, like, because this thing will cost 5 and this one will be 7 and it adds up eventually. But with those managed ones, you saw that the ones in the marketplace were about 1,000 each. So you can pick one of those and then perhaps add some custom ones on top of that, but you're not going to be picking 2 of those. If you pick the AWS ones, that core rule set is 700. So that's a big chunk of this. You can't pick all of the others, but perhaps you pick the Linux one and the database one and some other ones that were particularly relevant to you. And then you might have a bit of space for a custom rule or 2 left over. So you can see in this example, I've picked the core one, that's the top one there, and then a couple of other ones, and then I've got a custom rule at the bottom, and that came to just over 1,100. You've got 3 basic actions here. I've kind of mentioned block and allow already, but count adds a lot of additional power to this. Block basically means your requests go no further. You're going to return a 403 response by default. There's a default page for that, just a very basic forbidden page. You can customize that if you want to show a prettier page, but let's face it, at this point, you're not allowing someone in. So I'm not sure how much trouble you want to put into branding that. This may break your application. If you're running your application and you suddenly add a WAF to it, beware, because you may find that some of your application looks like cross-site request forgery or some of these vulnerabilities that it's trying to detect. So you need to test this first and be very careful about it before enabling it to block. And this is where count really comes in, because you can take one of those managed rule sets, which is set up to block by default, and you can override that behavior to count. What does count means? It means it continues on, but it's going to keep a metric that it matched that rule. And you can also log based upon things that count or block. So you can capture that in your logs and go through your logs and say, well, I counted all of these requests, but they don't look like they came from outside. These are part of my application that I would have blocked if I'd enabled this in block mode. And then you can address that either by changing how your application works, because perhaps you shouldn't be doing what you're trying to do, or perhaps by putting in an exclusion into your WAF rules that overrides that default behavior. You can get into some pretty complicated things, like you can override an individual rule within a rule set to count, and then you can have a supplementary custom rule that matches the count because you can label it, and then have some other criteria so that you block some of them, but not all of them. You can even pass information down to the application in forms of headers. So it can get quite complicated here, but it's very useful to be able to do that when you're first testing out new rules on your WAF. And then allow is basically, right, you're good to go, you can go straight in. So perhaps you want to put a particular IP range that you want to always allow regardless, put that at the first priority, and it just lets things straight in. It's not going to evaluate anything else. Also, you have to set a default for your web ACL. So if it's gone through all the rules and nothing matched, does it allow or does it block? In most cases, you're going to allow, and then you just set up some rules to block, but you can invert that and make the whole thing block, and then just allow for anything that matches particular rules. In that case, you would be using custom rules to define those. By itself, the web ACL does nothing. So you have to take that and you have to associate it with some resources to actually turn it into a web application firewall. We've already mentioned the different types of resources you can have. One thing you do have to be aware of is that if it's a CloudFront distribution, it's considered global, which means you probably have to be in US East 1 to create it, because that's the way US East 1 is. For the other ones, they're considered regional. So if you want to reuse it between load balancers, if you've got a load balancer in 2 different regions, you can't share the same web ACL. You'd have to set it up in both regions. But you could reuse it for 10 different load balancers and an API gateway and an AppSync distribution. So you can, basically apply some standards, define this once, and reuse it across many different resources. And the details of which resource it is will be available in the log messages you get. So you can say, well, it came from this particular load balancer. This wouldn't be much use by itself if you didn't have some monitoring for it. So we've got different monitoring capabilities. There are metrics in CloudWatch. You have some control over which things emit metrics and what those metrics are called. It's one of the slightly more confusing bits of the configuration. On the right-hand side here, you can see we've got a graph of some of the metrics. This is counting blocked requests. This is against the leading edge website. Apparently someone's trying to hack it. You can capture sample requests. I would say this is useful when you're initially testing a web ACL. Perhaps you're getting your feet wet with it. AWS WAF, but it's not actually very useful in a production environment because it's just a sample. If you want to actually see the details of why did this particular request get blocked, you've got no guarantee it's going to be in your samples if it's a live production site and other people are hitting it. So that's when you want to turn on the real logging, which captures every single request based on criteria. But typically, you probably set it to capture just things that are blocked or counted. You probably have some other form of logging that captures everything that's allowed already. Perhaps you have application load balancer logs. These logs can go to CloudWatch Logs, S3, or Kinesis Data Firehose. So Kinesis Data Firehose may then feed into something like Elasticsearch, or what's now OpenSearch. S3, you could be querying this with Athena. But with CloudWatch Logs, the example I'm using, we're using CloudWatch Logs Insights here. If you're not familiar with using CloudWatch Logs Insights, the syntax for querying is a little bit funky, but it works and it's pretty powerful. In this example, and I don't really expect you to read it all or see all the details, yeah, it's fairly legible, but essentially I'm just picking out some fields I care about and listing every single request in reverse timestamp order where the action at the end of the evaluation was that I blocked the request. Well, I can look at this and I can say, I'm getting some interesting attacks here. I'm getting them from these different country codes. So I've got China and Russia, and I think that's Singapore. I'm getting a few people trying to get AWS credential files. And then I can see that a lot of these got blocked because they had no user agent header, or they came from a user agent that's a known bad bot, or perhaps someone down there, there's some URI path ones, or server-side request forgery attempts. So you get a sense of the different attacks that are going on. And this way you can dig into those individual requests that perhaps got blocked and you didn't want to get blocked to find out exactly which rule they matched and what the details were. Now, if you're looking at a bigger picture, you might want to summarize something like this. And this is giving me counts of different categories. So I've grouped by request method, the URI and the rule ID, and ordered by descending count. And you can see that the most common thing here is, again, no user agent. We got bad bots. You get some interesting URLs turned up in these. What I like to do is if I see a URL I've never seen before, I'll go search for that, I'll Google for that. And what you'll find is, oh, this is some new vulnerability that someone's trying to attack on some kind of appliance or on Microsoft Active Directory or whatever it might be. And all of these people are trying to attack your system for it. Now, it may be you're not vulnerable for this, but some of these may be things that apply to the application frameworks that you're using, and people are actively attacking you. Honestly, after you've turned this on and seen the kind of things it's capturing, it would be hard to go and turn it back off again and just let that traffic through. You can set this up with CloudFormation. I would say kind of ugly. This is just defining 2 of those managed rules being added to a web ACL, and it's a lot of text. The format in here very closely ties to the underlying JSON structure that web ACL is configured with. So there are parts of this that just make no sense to me. Like I've got override action, none, empty object, and I have to include that. So I don't want to override it, and I've got to say that I don't want to override it. Yeah, okay. One thing I am doing here that is kind of an example is I'm setting a particular rule because part of our application broke with it on size restriction for body. So apparently we're posting up some pretty large bodies, larger than 8K in this application. So I'm excluding this rule. And confusingly, what this means is I'm counting this rule instead of blocking on this rule. That's what exclude means. You could also here set the override for the entire rule set to be count, and that's how you just would enable the whole rule set to be. It's somewhat confusing to set up, but it works once you've got it right eventually. In terms of cost, this isn't, the previous examples were from Leading Edge's website and the applications that we also run alongside that. This is from one of our clients. They have quite a bit more traffic than our website does. Our website can be pretty quiet. Please go look at our website and the AWS page on our website. But you can see this is a relatively inexpensive thing to add. This site here is deployed to multiple regions. When we look at US East 1, there's actually 3 environments that are all grouped together here because this is the report in the master account. But the total cost for all of these is $75 for a month. In the grand scheme of things, that is a tiny proportion of the bill we're talking about here that's in the quite a few thousands. So it's not particularly expensive to get started with. It's going to be cheaper than some of those third-party WAF products and just easier to, initially use. You don't have to go work with a vendor, put in purchase orders, get it approved. You can just turn this on and try it out and see how it works for you and what kinds of things it picks up in that count mode again, I would stress. There are some more advanced features. You can do some pretty complicated rules with Boolean logic, geo-blocking, things like that. For additional costs, there's these capture features. So if you've got people spamming comment forms, that's something you could add. I've honestly never seen a capture of this format that they show here, but apparently that's one of the example puzzles that they have. And then they've got this bot control feature. I've read about it. I don't entirely understand it, but I think the idea is it allows you to classify good bots versus bad bots. So if you want to allow things like website crawlers through, but not allow people who are actively trying to hack your site, this allows you to classify that and treat those differently. And that's really all I've got. So thank you. We've got a few minutes, so you can either take a break before the next session.